I buried my husband on a Tuesday morning in October, and by that afternoon, I'd already become the villain in a story I didn't write. My name is Dorothy and Sullivan, and I'm 63 years old. I've lived through 3 recessions, 2 divorces before Richard, and more disappointments than I care to count. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for the kind of cruelty that comes dressed in a black suit at a funeral, wearing your dead husband's eyes. If you've ever loved someone who had children from a previous marriage, you know exactly the tightrope I'm talking about. Comment below and tell me where you're watching this from. I want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you've got time after this, check the description box below for more stories like mine. Sometimes it helps just to know someone else has walked through the fire too. Richard Sullivan died of a heart attack in our kitchen on a Sunday evening. One moment he was laughing at something silly I'd said about the neighbor's dog, and the next he was on the floor, clutching his chest, looking at me with eyes that said goodbye before his mouth could. I held his hand while we waited for the ambulance. I whispered that I loved him. I told him he was safe. But he wasn't safe. He was dying. And there was nothing I could do but watch the man I'd spent 7 years loving slip away between my fingers like water. The funeral was small. Richard never liked a fuss. We held it at Riverside Memorial Chapel, the same place where we'd attended his brother's service 3 years prior. The October sun came through the stained glass in shafts of gold and crimson, painting everything in colors too beautiful for the occasion. I wore a simple black dress, nothing fancy, nothing that would draw attention. I wasn't trying to perform grief. I was drowning in it. Richard's son, Blake, arrived late. Blake Edward Sullivan, 37 years old, with his father's strong jaw and his mother's cold eyes. He walked in with his wife, Jennifer, a blonde woman who always looked like she'd just come from a tennis match at the country club. They didn't sit with me in the front row. They sat 3 rows back, and I could feel Blake's stare burning into the back of my head throughout the entire service. I'd known Blake for 7 years, ever since Richard and I started dating, but I'd never really known him, if that makes sense. He was always polite in that distant, performative way, smiled at holidays, said the right things. But there was always something underneath, something sharp and waiting. His mother, Patricia, had been Richard's first wife. She'd left Richard 20 years ago for another man, took a good chunk of money in the divorce, and barely saw Blake after that. But somehow, in Blake's mind, I was the problem. I was the woman who'd stolen his father's attention, his inheritance, his birthright. At the reception, held at our home because Richard had wanted people to gather somewhere warm and familiar, Blake finally made his move. I was standing by the fireplace, accepting condolences from Richard's college friend Walter, when Blake approached with a glass of whiskey in his hand. His face was flushed. His tie was loosened. And there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before, something unleashed. "Must be hard for you," he said, loud enough that the conversations around us started to fade. I looked at him, confused. "I'm sorry. All of this." He gestured around the room with his glass, sloshing a bit of amber liquid onto the carpet. "Playing the grieving widow. I'm sure it's exhausting." People were staring now. Walter stepped back slightly, uncomfortable. I felt my face grow hot, but I kept my voice steady. "Blake, I know you're hurting. We all are." He laughed, actually laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. "You know what's funny, Dorothy? You knew my father for, what, 7 years? I knew him for 37. And somehow, here you are, standing in his house, surrounded by his things, playing hostess like you built this life." "Blake." "No." He stepped closer, and I could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You were a secretary at his law firm. A secretary. You didn't go to college. You didn't come from money. And somehow, you managed to sink your claws into a man who was vulnerable after his divorce, and you rode that all the way to the bank." The room had gone completely silent. I could see Jennifer trying to tug on Blake's sleeve, whispering for him to stop, but he shook her off. "Gold digger," he said, the words falling like stones. "That's what you are. And everyone in this room knows it. You married my father for his money, and now that he's gone, you think you're just going to walk away with everything he built." Something inside me cracked. Not broke, cracked. Like ice over a frozen lake, spiderwebbing but not yet shattered. I'd spent 7 years being patient with this man, biting my tongue, trying to be understanding. I'd spent 7 years making myself smaller so he wouldn't feel threatened. And now, at my husband's funeral, with Richard barely cold in the ground, Blake was trying to humiliate me in front of everyone we knew. I could have yelled. I could have cried. I could have asked him to leave. But I didn't do any of those things. Instead, I walked calmly to the mahogany desk in the corner of the living room, Richard's desk, the one he'd inherited from his grandfather, and I opened the top drawer. Inside was a white envelope with Blake's name written across the front in Richard's handwriting. I'd found it a week before Richard died, tucked into his personal files with a note attached. * Dorothy, if anything happens to me, make sure Blake gets this. He needs to read it. Especially if he acts the way I think he might. *. Richard had known. Somehow, he'd known exactly how this would play out. I walked back across the room, every eye on me, and I handed the envelope to Blake. Your father wanted you to have this, I said quietly. Blake stared at the envelope like it might bite him. Then he looked at me, and for just a second, I saw something flicker across his face. Uncertainty. Maybe even fear. What is this? He asked. Read it, I said. Out loud, if you want. I think everyone here deserves to hear what your father really thought. And that's when everything changed. Blake's hands were shaking as he opened the envelope. I watched his eyes scan the first few lines of the letter, and I saw the exact moment the color drained from his face. His lips parted slightly. His jaw tightened. And then, slowly, he began to read aloud, though I think it was more from shock than any real desire to share. Blake, he read, his voice unsteady, *, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And if Dorothy is giving this to you, it means you've done exactly what I was afraid you'd do. You've treated her with disrespect, probably in front of people, probably at a moment when she's most vulnerable. I know you, son. I know how you think. And I need you to hear some things you've never wanted to hear. *. The room was so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Blake swallowed hard and continued. * Your mother left me 20 years ago. She didn't leave because I was a bad husband, though I'm sure I made mistakes. She left because she found someone with more money, someone who could give her a lifestyle I couldn't at the time. She took a substantial settlement, and then she disappeared from your life. I raised you, Blake. I paid for your school, your college, your law degree. I was at every game, every graduation, every moment that mattered. But somehow, you've rewritten history in your head. You've made me the villain and your mother the victim. *. Blake's voice cracked slightly, but he kept reading, almost mechanically now. *. When I met Dorothy, I'd been alone for 15 years. 15 years, Blake. I'd dated a few women, but nothing ever felt right. And then one day, this kind, funny, beautiful woman walked into my office with coffee and a smile, and for the first time in a decade and a half, I felt alive again. She didn't care about my money. In fact, she tried to pay for our first 3 dates herself because she didn't want me to think she was interested in my wallet. She made me laugh. She listened to me. She saw me, not the lawyer, not the man with the nice house, just me. *. I could feel tears burning behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not in front of Blake. *. We dated for 2 years before I proposed. 2 years, son. And during that time, I watched how you treated her. The cold shoulders at Christmas. The passive-aggressive comments. The way you'd talk over her at dinner or exclude her from family photos. I saw all of it, and I said nothing because I kept hoping you'd come around. I kept hoping you'd see what I saw, that Dorothy made me happy, and that's all that should have mattered. *. Blake's hands were trembling so badly now that the paper was rattling. Jennifer had gone pale beside him. *. After we married, I redid my will. I want you to know that Dorothy didn't ask me to do this. In fact, she doesn't even know the full details. But I made sure she was taken care of because she deserves to be taken care of. She gave up her job to take care of me when I got sick with pneumonia 2 years ago. She sat by my bedside every single night. She learned to cook all my favorite meals, even though she'd never been much of a cook before. She made my life better, Blake. And I will not have her punished for loving me. Asterisk. The room felt like it was holding its breath. I glanced around and saw people shifting uncomfortably, some wiping their eyes, others staring at Blake with expressions ranging from pity to disgust. Asterisk. Here's what you need to understand. Dorothy gets the house. She gets the life insurance. She gets the savings account and the investment portfolio I built specifically for our retirement together. You, Blake, are receiving exactly what I intended to leave you. A trust fund that will pay you a comfortable annual income, my law library, and the lake house that's been in our family for 3 generations. You're also receiving my personal effects, my watches, and the car collection you've always loved. In total, you're inheriting assets worth approximately $2.3 million. Asterisk. Blake stopped reading. His face had gone from pale to red, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. But the letter wasn't finished. Asterisk. If you're angry right now, if you're feeling cheated, then you've proven exactly why I made the choices I did. You're a grown man, Blake. You have a successful career as a lawyer. A career I helped you build. You have a beautiful wife and a comfortable life. But you've always wanted more. You've always measured your worth by what you have instead of who you are. And that, son, is something I could never fix, no matter how hard I tried. Asterisk. Blake's voice had dropped to barely a whisper now, but he kept reading, like he was in a trance. Asterisk. Dorothy loved me when I was sick. She loved me when I was difficult. She loved me when I was grieving the loss of my brother, when I was stressed about work, when I was just a grumpy old man complaining about the news. She didn't love me for what I could give her. She loved me for me. And that, Blake, is worth more than any inheritance. Asterisk. The letter ended with a single line that hit like a punch. Asterisk. I hope someday you'll understand that. And I hope someday you'll apologize to the woman who made your father's last years the happiest of his life. With love always, Dad. Asterisk. Blake lowered the letter. The room was absolutely silent. Tears were streaming down Jennifer's face. Walter was staring at the floor. And Blake looked like he'd just been struck by lightning. He looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw something other than contempt in his eyes. I saw shame. I saw regret. I saw the little boy who'd lost his mother and blamed everyone else for it. Dorothy, he started, but his voice broke. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The letter had said everything that needed to be said. Blake set the letter down on the coffee table, turned, and walked out of the house. Jennifer followed, mouthing "I'm sorry" to me as she passed. And just like that, the war I'd never wanted to fight was over. Or so I thought. The days after the funeral felt like walking through fog. People came and went, bringing casseroles, offering condolences, sitting with me for a while before inevitably leaving me alone with my grief. The house, which had always felt warm and alive when Richard was in it, now felt cavernous and cold. Every room echoed with his absence. His coffee mug still sat on the kitchen counter. His reading glasses were still folded on the nightstand. His slippers were still by the door, waiting for feet that would never fill them again. I didn't hear from Blake for 2 weeks. Part of me wondered if I ever would. Part of me didn't care. I'd spent so much energy over the years trying to win his approval, trying to prove I was worthy of his father's love, that the silence was almost a relief. I was tired. Tired of defending myself. Tired of being scrutinized. Tired of carrying the weight of someone else's resentment. But then, on a gray November morning, my doorbell rang. I almost didn't answer. I was in my bathrobe, my hair unwashed, a cup of tea growing cold in my hand. I wasn't expecting anyone. But the doorbell rang again, insistent, and I dragged myself to the door. Blake stood on my porch, and he looked terrible. His eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, his suit wrinkled like he'd slept in it. He held a bouquet of white roses, Richard's favorite, and he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, vulnerability. "Dorothy," he said, his voice hoarse. "Can I come in?" I should have said no. I should have closed the door in his face. But something in his expression stopped me, some echo of Richard I couldn't quite ignore. So I stepped aside and let him in. We sat in the living room, the same room where he'd called me a gold digger 2 weeks earlier. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Blake set the roses on the coffee table and then sat forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together like he was praying. "I don't know how to start," he said finally. "Then maybe don't," I replied, my voice harder than I'd intended. He flinched but nodded. "I deserve that. I deserve worse than that." For a long moment, he just sat there, staring at his hands. Then he looked up at me, and I saw tears in his eyes. "I read the letter again," he said. "About 50 times, actually. And I've been thinking about everything my dad said. About how I treated you. About how I treated him." His voice cracked. "He was right, Dorothy. About all of it. I have been rewriting history. I've been blaming you for things that had nothing to do with you. And I've been so focused on what I thought I deserved that I never stopped to think about what my father actually wanted." I didn't say anything. I just waited. "My mom left when I was 17, Blake continued, his words coming faster now, like a dam breaking. "And I know, it wasn't Dad's fault. I know she left because she wanted something he couldn't give her. But it was easier to be angry at him than at her, you know? Because he was there. He stayed. And somehow, in my messed up head, that made him the bad guy." He wiped at his eyes roughly, like he was angry at himself for crying. "And then you came along, and you made him happy. Really, genuinely happy. I could see it. Everyone could see it. But instead of being grateful that my father had found someone who loved him, I resented you for it. Because if you were good enough, then that meant my mom wasn't. And I didn't want to face that." I felt something shift inside me, not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. We all carry wounds. We all find ways to protect ourselves from pain, even when those ways hurt other people. "Blake," I said quietly, "your father loved you. Right up until the end. He wasn't trying to punish you with that letter. He was trying to help you see something you'd been missing." Blake nodded, tears streaming down his face now. "I know. And I'm sorry, Dorothy. I'm so sorry for what I said at the funeral. I'm sorry for every snide comment, every cold shoulder, every time I made you feel like you didn't belong. You did belong. You belonged more than anyone because you loved him without wanting anything in return." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote you something. It's not much, but I wanted you to have it." I took the paper, unfolded it, and began to read. It was a letter, Blake's letter to me. In it, he apologized for everything. He acknowledged every slight, every insult, every moment of cruelty. And at the end, he wrote something that made my breath catch. Asterisk, "You were the mother I needed when mine walked away. You were the stability my father deserved. And I'm sorry it took losing him for me to see that." Asterisk. I looked up at Blake, and for the first time, I didn't see Richard's angry, resentful son. I saw a broken man trying to find his way back to something good. "Thank you," I said softly. And I meant it. We talked for hours after that. He told me stories about Richard I'd never heard, about fishing trips and late-night talks and the way Richard used to burn pancakes every Sunday morning. I told him about the small, quiet moments Richard and I had shared. The way he'd hold my hand while we watched TV, the way he'd leave me notes on the bathroom mirror, the way he'd look at me sometimes like I was the most precious thing in his world. When Blake finally left, he hugged me, a real, genuine hug, and whispered, "Thank you for loving my dad." And just like that, the anger I'd been carrying for 7 years began to lift. If you've ever held on to anger because it felt safer than forgiveness, I hope you'll take a moment to let it go. It's heavy, and you don't have to carry it alone. And if you're finding comfort in this story, do me a favor. Check the description box below. There are more stories there, stories of people who've survived betrayal and came out stronger. Sometimes we all need to know we're not the only ones fighting our battles. It's been 3 years since Richard died. 3 years since Blake stood on my porch with white roses and a heart full of regret. 3 years since I read that letter aloud and watched the truth reshape a family. I still live in the house. Our house. I thought about selling it at first, thought maybe the memories would be too heavy to carry. But then I realized something. The memories weren't weighing me down. They were holding me up. Every room in this house has a piece of Richard in it, and I'm not ready to let that go. Maybe I never will be. Blake and I talk now. Not every day, but regularly. He calls on Sundays, usually after church, and we talk about small things. His work, Jennifer's new job, the garden I'm planning for spring. Last month, he invited me to dinner. We sat at a restaurant downtown, and halfway through the meal he said, "You know, Dad would have loved this. You and me just talking. He always wanted that." And he was right. Richard would have loved it. Jennifer and I have grown close too. She sends me recipes she thinks I'd like. We meet for coffee sometimes. She told me once, quietly, that she'd always admired how I handled Blake's hostility with grace. "I would have lost my mind," she said. "But you never did. You just kept loving Richard, and that was enough." That's the thing they don't tell you about love. It doesn't always look like fireworks and grand gestures. Sometimes love looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like staying when it would be easier to leave. Sometimes it looks like holding your ground when someone tries to make you feel small, not because you're stubborn, but because you know your worth. I've started volunteering at the community center downtown, teaching basic computer skills to older folks who didn't grow up with technology. It's funny, I was a secretary for 30 years, and people like Blake always made me feel like that wasn't enough. But these people, these beautiful, grateful people, they look at me like I'm giving them the world. And maybe I am. Maybe that's what matters. Not the size of your contribution, but the heart behind it. I think about Richard every day. Some days the grief still hits me like a wave, sudden, overwhelming, knocking the breath out of me. I'll smell his cologne on an old jacket, or I'll hear a song we used to dance to in the kitchen, and I'll have to sit down and just feel it. But other days, the grief is gentler. It's a soft ache, a reminder that I was lucky enough to love someone deeply, and to be loved deeply in return. The money Blake was so worried about? I donated a portion of it to the legal aid clinic where Richard used to volunteer. I set up a scholarship fund in his name for first-generation college students studying law. And the rest? I'm living on it, comfortably and without guilt, because Richard wanted me to be taken care of. He worked his whole life to build something stable, something safe, and he chose to share that with me. I'm not going to apologize for accepting his love in all its forms. There's a picture on my mantle, Richard and me at the lake house, both of us laughing at something I can't even remember now. We look so happy in that photo, so utterly content. That's how I try to remember him, happy whole mine. Not the man dying on the kitchen floor, but the man who danced with me in the rain, who brought me coffee in bed, who looked at me every single day like I was a miracle he didn't deserve. If you've ever been called names you didn't deserve, if you've ever been judged for loving someone or for how you loved someone, I want you to know this: you don't owe anyone an explanation. You don't owe anyone proof of your worth. The right people will see it. The right people will honor it. And the wrong people? Eventually, they'll either come around, or they'll fade into the background of your life where they belong. Blake learned that. I learned that. And now, I'm teaching myself something even harder: how to be happy again. Not happy in spite of Richard's absence, but happy with it. Happy knowing I was lucky enough to have those 7 years. Happy knowing that love, real love, doesn't end when someone dies, it just changes shape. I've started dating again, casually. Nothing serious, just coffee here and there with kind men who make me laugh. I'm not looking to replace Richard, no one could ever do that. But I'm learning to let joy back into my life in small doses. I'm learning that loving Richard doesn't mean closing my heart forever. If anything, it means the opposite. He loved me so well that I know what good love looks like now. And I won't settle for less. Some people might think that's disloyal. Some people might think I should spend the rest of my life in mourning, wearing black and staring at old photographs. But Richard wouldn't have wanted that. He told me once, near the end, "Dorothy, when I'm gone, I want you to live. Really live. Don't just survive. Don't just exist. Find joy. Find laughter. Find someone who makes you feel alive." I cried when he said it, told him I couldn't imagine loving anyone else. And he smiled, that gentle, knowing smile, and said, "You don't have to imagine it now. But promise me you'll stay open to it." So I'm keeping that promise. I'm staying open. I'm staying soft, even when the world tries to harden me. I'm choosing hope over bitterness, connection over isolation, love over fear. And Blake? Blake is learning too. He's learning that family isn't about blood or money or who gets what when someone dies. It's about showing up. It's about apologizing when you're wrong. It's about choosing love over pride, even when pride feels safer. Last week, he brought his kids by, two beautiful little girls I'd only met a handful of times before. They ran through the house, laughing and playing, and Blake watched them with this look on his face. Part joy, part sorrow. "I wish Dad could see them," he said quietly. "He can," I told him. And I believed it. "Before you go, I want to thank you for listening to my story. I know it wasn't easy. There were hard parts, painful parts, parts where you probably wanted to reach through the screen and shake some sense into people. But you stayed. And that means more to me than you know. If you found something meaningful in this story, please check the description box below. There are more stories there, stories of survival and strength and the messy, beautiful resilience of the human heart. We all need to know we're not alone in our struggles. We all need to be reminded that broken things can heal, that bitter things can soften, that endings can also be beginnings. Thank you for being here. Thank you for bearing witness to my life, my love, my grief, and my healing. And remember, you are worthy of love. You are worthy of respect. You are worthy of a life that feels full and whole and yours. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise.